The doctors said my memories stopped 5 years ago. I remembered being in love, but not with the stranger who called herself my wife. When I opened my eyes in that blindingly white hospital room, the world felt split in two. My mind was still 25, wild, ambitious, in love with a girl whose laugh could stop my heart. But beside me stood a woman in a tailored black suit, eyes sharp as glass, lips pressed into a line that looked more like a contract signature than a smile. She was beautiful, undeniably so, polished, elegant, the kind of woman who owned boardrooms with a glance. But her hand on mine felt cold. Foreign. I didn't recognize her perfume, her touch, not even the weight of her presence. They said she was my wife. My wife. Married for 3 years. A life I couldn't remember, a love that felt like someone else's story. I searched for warmth in her gaze, but found only distance. Ice. Something told me that even before the crash, her heart had been locked away. So I asked her for a divorce, and that's when she shattered. The last thing I remembered before the crash was a cheap apartment with peeling wallpaper, a desk stacked with rejected manuscripts, and a girl with ink-stained fingers who swore we would conquer the world together. Her name was Lily. She had a laugh that carried me through every failure, a voice that turned silence into song. That was 5 years ago, at least, in my mind. But when I opened my eyes again, the world had rewritten itself. I wasn't in that apartment anymore. I wasn't chasing dreams. I wasn't with Lily. Instead, I was in a sprawling mansion with polished marble floors that echoed under every step. There were crystal chandeliers, a wine cellar bigger than my childhood home, and a wardrobe filled with suits I didn't remember ever buying. And her. They told me she was my wife, Clara. A name that sounded sharp, businesslike, not soft like Lily's. Clara was everything a man was supposed to want, tall, elegant, the kind of beauty that intimidated rather than invited. She carried herself like someone who didn't walk but negotiated with gravity. Yet when I looked at her, my chest was empty. No spark. No warmth. "Don't push yourself," she said that first night home, voice clipped, efficient. She placed a bowl of soup in front of me like it was a corporate deal being closed. "The doctors said it'll take time for your memories to come back." Her tone wasn't gentle. It was expectant, as if she was waiting for me to sign a contract I hadn't read. I studied her across the dinner table, the clink of silverware echoing in the silence. Her eyes never softened. She ate methodically, back straight, lips moving with mechanical precision. This was my wife. The mansion felt like a museum. No laughter echoed off the walls, no framed pictures of goofy smiles or messy moments. Instead, every corner displayed her taste, abstract art, sharp furniture, walls that looked staged for a magazine spread. It was beautiful, yes, but hollow. At night, I lay in the massive bed beside her. She faced away from me, shoulders rigid, as though even in sleep she refused to surrender control. I couldn't imagine ever reaching for her in love. I couldn't imagine ever hearing her say my name the way Lily once had. But sometimes, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her cry. Quiet, muffled sobs pressed into the pillow. The kind of crying someone does when they've carried too much for too long. And when the tears ended, I felt her turn to face me in the dark, her breath shaky. There was something in the way she looked at me then, like she was watching a ghost. That haunted me more than the amnesia itself. Why did she cry for me? Why did her gaze flicker with grief when the rest of her was made of stone? One morning, fragments came back to me. A flash of Clara standing in the rain, hair plastered to her face, smiling at me as if I was her only salvation. Another memory, her hand slipping into mine under a dinner table, hidden from the crowd, her thumb tracing soft circles on my skin. Those glimpses felt like stolen dreams, too warm to belong to the woman who now treated me like an obligation. They unsettled me. I tried to ask her about them once. "Clara," I said cautiously, "did we love each other? Really love?" For the first time, her composure cracked. Her fork froze midway to her mouth. Her eyes flickered, wet and desperate, before she quickly looked away. "You wouldn't be here if we didn't," she answered, voice flat, final. But her hands trembled as she put the fork down. That's when I realized the truth was buried beneath layers of silence. Somewhere in the 5 years I'd lost, something had broken. And no matter how luxurious the mansion was, no matter how perfect life looked from the outside, I was living with a stranger who treated me like a possession she was terrified to lose. And I couldn't stop asking myself, if she was my wife, why did I feel like she had already buried me? The days blurred together inside that mansion. Every morning, Clara left before sunrise, heels clicking against the marble, phone pressed to her ear as she barked orders to people I never saw. Every evening, she returned, flawless as ever, her perfume announcing her arrival long before she walked into the room. But between those hours, I was alone, with my fractured mind, my memories, and the gnawing feeling that none of this life fit me. I tried asking questions at first. About our wedding. About friends we shared. About why there were no children in this sprawling palace of silence. People avoided answers. Her assistant, a nervous young woman named Rachel, once slipped and said, "You used to argue a lot, but," before Clara appeared in the doorway, her voice like a blade, "That'll be all, Rachel." The girl went pale and fled. Even Clara's mother, who visited one afternoon with pearls hanging heavy on her neck, gave me nothing but smiles too polished to be sincere. When I asked, what was Clara like when we first got together, she squeezed my hand and said, she was happy. But her eyes betrayed her, darting to her daughter, lips tightening into silence. The walls of that mansion held secrets, and I was the only one not allowed to hear them. The first real crack came late one night. I was wandering the hallway, restless, the shadows stretching long across the floor. That's when I heard her voice, low, sharp, behind the closed door of her study. I froze. "She doesn't remember, this could be my second chance," she whispered. My chest tightened. She wasn't talking to me. I pressed closer, ear against the wood. "No, I won't lose him again. This time, Her words stopped suddenly. Silence. Then the scrape of her chair. I hurried back to bed, heart hammering. When she walked into the room minutes later, her expression was smooth, unreadable. She slid into bed beside me, lying stiffly on her side. I stared at the ceiling, pretending to sleep, but the words replayed in my head like a curse: second chance. A second chance for what? To keep me trapped. To rewrite the past. The next day, I began searching. In the bottom drawer of a desk, I found old photographs. Clara and I, smiling at beaches, toasting with champagne, standing arm in arm at charity galas. On the surface, we looked like a dream couple. But as I studied each picture, I realized something horrifying. My smiles weren't real. There was a stiffness in my jaw, a tension in my eyes. Clara's hand always clutched me too tightly, as if she feared I would slip away. The poses looked rehearsed, like advertisements rather than memories. Then I found the letters. Dozens of them, written in my own handwriting. Words of love, devotion, sacrifice. Letters telling her I'd give up everything for her, that I couldn't breathe without her. Reading them felt like trespassing into the soul of a stranger. I couldn't remember writing a single word. My chest didn't swell with recognition or warmth, it burned with alienation. Who was the man who had begged for her love? Was he me? Or had she broken him so completely that I could no longer recognize myself in him? That night at dinner, I asked the question that had been festering in my chest. Why did we even get married? The clink of her fork against porcelain was the only sound for a long moment. Then, slowly, she lifted her eyes to mine. A smile curved her lips, not tender, not amused. Cold. Because once upon a time, she said, voice soft but edged with steel, you begged me to. Her words sliced through me. My appetite vanished. Begged. The man I remembered being would never beg. The man I remembered was proud, reckless, too full of fire to kneel for anyone. Had she tamed me? Or had she broken me? I pushed the plate away. Then maybe that man was a fool. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. From then on, the distance between us grew like a canyon. She tried to bridge it with gestures, expensive watches, tailored suits, trips to restaurants where the menus didn't even list prices. But each gift felt like a shackle. I started watching her more closely. How she scanned her emails before bed with feverish obsession. How her hand twitched when she reached for me, only to stop short, as though afraid I'd recoil. How she smiled at me in public, dazzling and flawless, only for the smile to vanish the second the cameras were gone. And always, the nights. The muffled sobs she thought I couldn't hear. The way she looked at me, her face lit by moonlight, as if memorizing features she feared would disappear. She wasn't just cold. She was desperate. But desperate for what? My love? My loyalty? Or something darker? I started to think the marriage wasn't real. Or at least, not real love. Maybe it had been convenience, or manipulation. Maybe she had used me, molded me, until I'd become that begging man in the letters. The thought poisoned everything. Every glance she gave me. Every word she spoke. Every touch of her hand on mine. The mansion became a cage, its luxury nothing but polished bars. I wanted out. The decision came quietly one night, as I lay in that bed beside her, listening to her slow, measured breathing. Divorce. It was the only answer. I didn't know what it would do to her empire, her perfect facade, or her coldly composed world. I didn't care. All I knew was that I didn't love her. I couldn't love her. And if she had truly broken me once before, I wouldn't let her do it again. The cracks in my life widened until they became chasms. Once, I thought the silence in the mansion was emptiness. Now, I realized it was the echo of all the things Clara and I never said. I started digging, not just through the drawers and photo albums, but through people. Old colleagues, forgotten numbers in my phone, contacts that Clara hadn't erased. That's how the truth began to unravel. I met Daniel first, an old friend from my university days. He looked older, wearier, but when he saw me, his face paled like he'd seen a ghost. I heard about the accident, he said, shifting uneasily in the cafe seat. But I didn't think you'd actually call me. Why wouldn't I? I asked. He sighed, leaning closer. Because Clara made sure to cut everyone out of your life. Me, Lily, everyone who reminded you of who you were before. The name hit me like a hammer. Lily. The girl from my last memory. My anchor. I swallowed hard. What do you mean she cut you out? Daniel looked around, lowered his voice. You gave up everything for her, man. Your writing, your teaching job, your friends. You built her empire with your connections, your ideas, and once she had it all, she didn't need you anymore. She changed. Cold. Ruthless. The words burned. You tried to fight it, at first, he continued. But you loved her too much. You stayed, even when she tore you down. I leaned back, dizzy. The letters. The photographs. The man who begged. Daniel was describing him. And Lily? I whispered. His face softened. She waited for you. For a while. But you never came back. Whispers followed me after that. Rumors. Clara's name in business journals painted her as a queen, and a villain. Ruthless deals. Companies crushed. Rivals destroyed. Men who once admired her now spoke of closed-door meetings, and arrangements that sounded like affairs but were never proven. The image of her laughing in candlelight with another man twisted my stomach. But worse than the rumors was the picture of myself that emerged. A man who once had fire but traded it for chains. A man who had let her ambition eclipse his soul. I wasn't sure if I hated her more, or myself. The confrontation came one night when she came home late, the sound of her heels tapping sharp against the marble. I was waiting in the study, the letters spread across the desk like evidence at a trial. She froze when she saw them. "Where did you find those?" Her voice was tight. "In the drawer you thought I wouldn't check." I held one up, the ink smeared by old fingerprints, my fingerprints. "I don't remember writing them. And maybe that's a blessing." Her composure faltered. For the first time, her shoulders slumped, her mask cracking. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then make me." My voice was harder than I expected. "What happened to us? Why do people say I gave up everything for you? Why do they say you ruined me?" She sank into the chair opposite me, her hands trembling as she clutched the armrest. For a moment, she looked less like a CEO and more like a frightened woman. "I did ruin us," she admitted. You were the brightest part of my life. But I wanted more. I wanted power. Control. I thought I could have both, you and the empire. But somewhere along the way, I stopped holding your hand and started stepping on it to climb higher." Her eyes filled with tears. "You loved me so much you stayed, even when I was cruel. Even when I made you beg for scraps of the woman you once knew. I watched the light go out of you, and I didn't stop it. I thought if I could just build enough, if I could make us invincible, it would fix everything." Her voice cracked. "And then the accident happened. When they told me you couldn't remember. I thought it was fate giving me another chance. A chance to love you the way I should have from the beginning." Her confession was a knife. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand how she could destroy me and then dare to call it fate. Another part wanted to crumble, because in her trembling voice I heard a woman who truly had loved me once, and lost herself along the way. I clenched my fists, forcing the fury to speak louder than pity. "I'm not the man you married anymore," I said coldly. "And even if I was, I wouldn't want to be." Her face broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, streaking the flawless mask she wore like armor. She slid from her chair to her knees, clutching my hands with desperate strength. "Please. Don't say that. I can change. I can love you right this time. I swear I'll give up everything." I pulled my hands away. "You already had everything. And it wasn't enough." She sobbed openly then, the mighty CEO reduced to a child begging not to be abandoned. Her mascara smudged, her voice cracked, and her grip on me was so tight it hurt. But I felt nothing. No warmth. No forgiveness. Only the hollow ache of a love that had died long before my memory ever did. I stood, leaving her crumpled on the floor. Her cries followed me down the hall, echoing in the cavernous house. But I didn't turn back. Not this time. I remember the day my anger finally found a shape. It wasn't in the dramatic moment of her sobbing on the study floor. It came later, alone in the library, when I held one of my old letters and realized the man who wrote those words didn't belong to me anymore. He had been artfully dismantled, by her words, by her indifference, by the slow, surgical way she altered my life until I fit her needs. Humiliation had a rhythm. She'd done it in public, where it would hurt the most. I remembered a gala, dim lights, champagne, her standing by a podium. I'd made a joke about my writing career, the audience laughed politely. She smiled, but then, casually, she corrected me in front of everyone. "He was never serious about that," she had said, voice like glass sliding across concrete. "We were practical. He wanted stability." Laughter. The joke dissolved into a spectacle of my smallness. My face had burned, I'd laughed too, volunteer embarrassment, and the room moved on. But the stitch in my chest tightened. That evening was a public lesson, she would define me. There were other moments, offhand remarks disguised as concern. "You're too sensitive for this world," she told me once, when I argued about staying true to an idea. "People use softness against you." She said it was like a diagnosis. Not a defense of me. An indictment. I learned then that her care often wore cruelty as camouflage. When the memory of those small cruelties came back in full, something colder than pain settled over me. Rage was useful. Rage had direction. I decided that if she had spent years shaping me into a man who begged and swallowed, I would spend my next years shaping myself into someone who could take the one thing she loved most, control. I made a list. It was my first practical act of revenge: names, weaknesses, habits, loyalties. People she relied on. People she had undermined. Suppliers who'd been stiffed. Board members who had quietly resented her. Rivals she'd humiliated publicly. Not all of them liked me, some resented the man I'd become under her thumb, but resentment and opportunity were cousins. I reached out, quietly, like someone knocking at a half-closed door. Rebuilding started with old friends. Daniel answered the first call. His relief sounded like a key turning in a rusted lock. "You're alive," he said. "And you're finally awake." We met in a cramped diner that smelled of coffee and burnt sugar. No marble. No perfume. Just him and me and a battered booth that felt honest. He introduced me to people I hadn't seen in years: editors, teachers, one or two journalists who still remembered my byline. They were cautious, then curious, and then willing when they heard how Clara had isolated me. "You left with nothing," one editor said, pushing a sugar packet across the table. "If you want your name back, you'll have to fight." I wanted my name back, and I wanted something else: to be the instrument that toppled the ivory throne she'd built on other people's bones. But I knew emotional spite alone would not unseat a woman who had learned to weaponize the truth. I needed leverage. I needed proof. I needed allies in places where she thought she did not have rivals. Clara's enemies were a strange assortment: embittered former partners, betrayed suppliers, the occasional ex-lover whose flattery had turned bitter. I called the ones whose bitterness was public and the ones whose tongues were sharp but careful. I listened more than I spoke. In those conversations, small openings appeared: a ledger that didn't add up, a supplier who'd been asked to funnel money through a shell company, a corporate charity event whose invoices were inflated. Rumors, simmering, ugly, began to solidify into patterns. I avoided illegal fantasies. I didn't hack. I didn't bribe. I worked with lawyers, journalists, people who still had the luxury of conscience. That was the important part: the plan had to look like truth when it landed. If it looked like revenge, it would be dismissed as spite. If it looked like justice, it would be unstoppable. I met a lawyer named Malik. He had a face like an oak table, sturdy and scarred. He asked the right questions. Where was the paper trail? Who handled the transfers? How could we turn whispers into records? He taught me how corporations hid things behind layers of subsidiaries and how a relentless, legal hand could peel those layers away. He was careful in a way that felt like moral armor. I liked him. I needed him. There were nights I replayed Clara's phone call: "She doesn't remember, this could be my second chance." As if she'd cast a seed and I had to water the soil. I went back to her assistant, Rachel, who responded to me like a rat who had not yet chosen which side to run to. She was frightened. For months, she'd seen Clara give orders that were sharp as knives. She'd seen money moved in odd directions. She'd watched Clara turn friends into numbers. "Clara isn't untouchable," Rachel whispered once, hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "She's very good at making people think mistakes are their own." That admission was a map. I had to be patient. I spent days compiling documents, piecing together ledgers, stitching emails to payments, making a pattern that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. I kept my records neat, my language precise. I wanted to show not a man ruined by a woman, but a system corrupted by a woman who'd convinced everyone she was indispensable. I also reclaimed the part of me she'd stolen, slowly, with small humiliating wins. I started writing again. Short columns at first, anonymous op-eds that bit at the edges of a corporate world I'd once loved. My prose was leaner now. It had teeth. People noticed. I reconnected with readers who had once read my essays on stubborn hope. I taught a night class at the community college, meager pay, honest students. It was humbling. It was healing. It was practical. And while I rebuilt my soul in public, I rebuilt my networks in secret. I sat in rooms with her competitors, smiling and asking the right questions. I didn't pretend to be anything but the man I was, no grand cloak of righteousness. I told them what I had remembered, the humiliation, the letters that read like a stranger's confessions. I offered them something they craved, the possibility that Clara was vulnerable, that she could be outmaneuvered. Some took the bait. Some didn't. The ones who did help by opening doors Malik used to subpoena documents or by passing along off-the-record tips about shady deals. It was messy. It was slow. But it moved like water, persistent and patient. Still, the plan had costs. Coldness seeped into me. I watched my hands and sometimes didn't recognize them. Where once I'd been tremulous with love, I grew steady with intention. I stopped lying to myself that I might someday forgive her. Forgiveness felt like an indulgence I no longer deserved. My heart calcified around a core of purpose. It kept me awake at night in a way that felt clean. There were setbacks. Clear, stinging setbacks that almost made me break. One afternoon, Rachel called me in a panic. "She's asking why you're meeting with the board," she whispered. Clara had become suspicious, sudden, meticulous in question and tone. She started watching me differently. Her eyes no longer merely catalogued, they searched. She began attending more dinners, staying late at the office with a presence that felt like a shadow. Her guards grew tighter. Her messages increased. One evening she cornered me in the kitchen, the house quieter than usual. "You've been seeing people," she said, calm but cold. "Why?" For a second I saw it, the woman who had crawled back, who wanted to stitch us together with fragile promises. She reached for my arm, the gesture a nostalgic echo. For a second, the old ache surfaced. I found my fingers wanting to answer with tenderness, to say maybe, to forgive for the sake of the man I once was. Instead I felt every small cruelty she'd administered, every public cut, every night she'd cried privately only so she could plead louder in public. The flashes of rain and secret hands under tables hadn't been enough to hold me. They were memories, not lives. "I'm building my life," I said, voice steady. "You built yours on someone else's bones. I won't be one of them again." She stared. Then she spoke the oldest lie, soft, almost pleading. "We could try. We could start over." I wanted to say yes at that moment. I wanted the warmth of my old life. But what she offered was a bargain, my erasure, again. I didn't want to be the man who forgot himself for her convenience. "No," I said. "I won't be your reset." Her eyes shifted, hurt, anger, something like calculation. That look told me I'd not yet won. It told me revenge would be a war, not a single strike. There were other dangers. The more I dug, the more I realized how many people she'd made untouchable by debt, by contracts, by favors owed. Every time we thought we had a lead, a new firewall appeared, NDAs, blank signatures, shell corporations. Malik thrummed with impatience, but he was careful. "We move too fast, we lose the case," he warned. "A smart opponent will bury you in counterclaims." And Clara was smart. She began to counter with charm and gifts, public gestures so grand they looked, at first glance, like repentance. A scholarship fund named in my honor. A public statement about the accident and her devotion. A floral display in the lobby of her company with a single note, to the man who fought so bravely. It was performative. It was poison. People who didn't know us clapped and admired us. People who had loved me and then been pushed away stood silent, not sure where to place their shame. Each gesture searched for a soft spot in me. Each small kindness reopened a tiny fissure of doubt. I nearly slipped. I thought of Lily once, her ink-stained fingers, her laugh. I pictured her in a doorway waiting. For a naked moment I craved a simple life again, coffee, long walks, a book with my name on the spine. But the memory of the public gala, her correction, the laughter, would flare up like a cauterizing flame. I'd remember the letters I'd written, the man who had begged. I had a new image then, not of a lover, but of myself on my knees, asking permission to exist in my own life. That image hardened into resolve. I could not let nostalgia blind me. So I continued. Quietly. Methodically. I gathered proof. I rebuilt, publicly and privately. I strengthened alliances. I let my coldness be my tool. Each small victory, an email revealed, a payment traced, a supplier willing to testify, was a chisel strike against her marble pedestal. And with every strike, I felt the shape of the final blow forming. Not in a feverish imagination of theatrical cruelty, but in the practical certainty that someone who had built an empire on other people's erasures would face the daylight of accountability. That was the plan. That was my revenge. Not to humiliate her with petty cruelty, but to return to her the world she had built and watch it fracture under the weight of truth. There would be more setbacks. There would be nights when I almost reached for the woman who stood in the rain in my memory. But each time, the recollection of having been made small for her convenience would steady my hand. I had been erased once. I refused to be erased again. I stood outside the glass doors of her boardroom and felt the room's heat before I saw it, the thin, frantic warmth of people who think they still hold something. It was late morning, the city gleamed beyond the windows. Inside, Clara's executive team sat like generals behind a map, faces polished, expressions practiced. Her nameplate glinted on the table. She moved in that room like a queen among courtiers, commanding, flawless, immune. Except she wasn't. I'd spent months laying the groundwork. Malik had filed careful motions that forced stubborn ledgers into the light. Journalists I knew, some old readers, some skeptical, had started whispering in the right ears. Suppliers who'd been paid late, or not at all, sent sworn statements. Former partners produced emails with signatures that matched payments traced to shell accounts. It was a slow, legal unspooling, and today all of it landed on Clara's desk like a verdict. I had no right to be there, technically. But Clara's company had allowed me in. Maybe they thought I would be quiet, or humiliated, or grateful, whatever a defeated husband looks like in their imagination. Instead, I carried a folder with clean photocopies. I walked in like a shareholder, because by then, I had become one in more ways than one. Clara's eyes found me across the table. For a half-second, there was recognition, then the armor snapped back into place. She smiled thinly. "You shouldn't be here," she said, polite as poison. "You should be." I laid the folder down between us. The clack of its edges on the wood sounded final. "Open it." Her chief counsel made a show of protesting. "This meeting." "It's my meeting now," I said. The room shifted. Board members exchanged glances, small shivers passing like a draft. I let them read. I watched the flat faces fold into something else. The treasurer's jaw tightened. A marketing VP's eyes grew wet, not with tears but with alarm. Pages turned. There were invoices. There were transfers. There were emails with bland subject lines and barbaric intent. There were payments routed through companies that existed only on paper. There were memos in Clara's hand, brief, crisp, approving bonuses to vendors who later vanished. There were names of charities we'd once pretended to help that had never received a check. "This is a witch hunt," someone murmured on Clara's side. Circumstantial. Not when the receipts matched the transfers, Malik said, standing beside me for the first time. He moved through the room like a man who had lived inside courtrooms his whole life. He produced spreadsheets, timestamps, and cross-references. He was meticulous, fatal in his calmness. He put a redacted wire transfer on the table and tapped it. Here. Shellco A to Supplier X. Supplier X to Vendor Y. Vendor Y to account with no physical office. Repeat pattern, repeated over 2 years. A hand went up. Forgery. Clara's counsel tried to smother it, but the papers were too neat, too real. Statements from suppliers named the projects, the dates, the men who had signed their names on receipt. Employees who had once feared Clara now nodded when questioned. The long list of small, consistent omissions told a story that rumor never could. You orchestrated diversions, Malik said quietly, and you used your personal influence to make sure those who could have stopped you were silenced. He turned toward Clara. The board needs to ask, did you authorize these, personally? Clara's face hardened. She had rehearsed this, anger, indignation, the righteous wound. This is slander, she said. A personal vendetta. Then answer. Swear on your career, on this company's seal. Did you or did you not authorize these movements? A board member asked the question with the voice of someone who had started to feel betrayed. Clara's silence was an island. She lunged for the script, deflect, accuse, threaten, but the script had holes. People who had been hushed were speaking into legal tapes. And then an unexpected thing happened. One by one, people I'd quietly won over months, suppliers who had been stiffed and then serenely invited to testify, stood. They read statements. They handed envelopes to the company's audit committee. A rival CEO I'd met months before, one I'd once called an enemy, sat with a calm I recognized from our conversations and announced that his firm's independent auditors had found similar patterns in a joint venture with Clara's company. You should have seen Clara then. The queen without a crown. Her mouth opened, closed. Her composure flickered. She scanned the room and found not one of her old allies willing to die on her sword. The board's loyalty had always been conditional, transactional. When the balance sheet showed danger, even the closest courtiers counted their chips. I listened, quietly. This was not about me. This was about consequence. Given the evidence, the lead independent director said finally, slow, methodical, I move we appoint an independent counsel and suspend Ms. Voss from executive duties pending an external audit. A murmur. Clara's eyes flashed. She reached across the table, perhaps for theatrics, perhaps for me. This is a smear, she repeated. He's a disgruntled husband. He's a shareholder, someone interjected, and for the first time I felt the room pivot around me. A new alignment. A few months earlier, those voices would have sided with her. Now they listened to the proof. Now they listened to the facts. The motion passed. Clara's hand flew to her throat. This is illegal. You have no standing to. You have legal troubles you cannot manage alone, Malik said, ice steady. You're not above the law. She glared at me with an intensity that was almost terrifying, like a woman who hated seeing herself revealed. This is your revenge, she hissed. You set this up. It's not revenge, I said. It's accountability. She scoffed, sputtered, then laughed, a short, terrible bark. You think this ends me? I wanted to tell her the truth, that I had not wanted this initially. That at first I only wanted to be free. But I kept my mouth shut. Whether it was mercy or strategy, I would not say. The headlines hit like a second, slower accident. Within hours, reporters circled. The quiet drip of evidence became a flood. The stock price, once a steady climb, did what markets do when a leader fractures at the seams, it stumbled, then dropped. Clients called lawyers. Partners paused negotiations. The charity events were cancelled. Claymore reputations are hard to rebuild once the first shovelful of dirt is turned. And Clara responded like someone punched. She struck with everything she had: PR campaigns, impassioned interviews, an op-ed declaring her dedication to transparency that looked, oddly, like someone trying to stitch silk over a burn. She turned on the charm offensives one by one: donations, public showings of contrition, a well-staged apology that looked as much about optics as remorse. It almost worked on the public. People like a redemption story. But the facts kept arriving. Each new document, each corroborating witness was like another nail in a coffin. Her empire fractured in private corners first. The board quietly forced out executives loyal to her, contracts were renegotiated, creditors tightened terms. Deals fell through. Suppliers demanded audits they hadn't dared ask for before. The web she had woven around herself began to tear. The part that felt most delicious, if such a word applies, was the way her rivals treated her. The men who once envied her conquests circled like wolves, but not with teeth exposed. They moved with the quiet business of predators who take advantage of a weakened animal. Offers she once would have scorned, buyouts, mergers, salvage agreements, arrived with strings. The firm that had toppled others was now the firm being picked apart, disassembled into pieces someone else would sell at a profit. I orchestrated no single dramatic flame. That wasn't my style. I worked the small levers: a quiet threat here, a subpoena there, a friendly shareholder meeting where votes shifted because a few influential stakeholders realized their own personal risk. Strategically, I let the structure collapse under its own weight, and it did, with a cruel, systematic efficiency that made me ashamed and proud at once. She fought back fiercely. There were lawsuits, counterclaims that sounded like theater but were meant to intimidate. There were subpoenas for my correspondence, attempts to show me as a meddling husband with a personal grudge. She leaked stories suggesting I'd been drunk on nostalgia and revenge. She hired investigators who dug into my past. That part stung. The man she painted, weak, unstable, was a narrative she assumed would sway people who wanted a tidy story. It almost did, in a few op-ed columns grudgingly sympathetic to the actress of a broken marriage. But the truth, when presented, clean and verifiable, broke through those defenses. Malik was careful. Each step we'd taken was documented. Each phone call had a timestamp. Each payment had a fingerprint. The more Clara tried to bend the story, the more evidence we had that held it straight. And people began to turn on her not from spite, but from fear. Fear that any one of them could wake up one morning on the wrong side of her ambition, exposed for a mistake she'd made them complicit in. Fear makes allies. And allies make power. In private, I watched her with measured distance. One night, I saw her in the lobby of the building after a public hearing. She was paper-thin, mascara streaks under her eyes, moving through a crowd that used to part for her. A junior exec I'd befriended from months earlier brushed past her without greeting. For a long time she'd been untouchable. Now she was touchable. There was a scene I relive often, a press conference where Clara stood at a podium meant to reclaim narrative. She said the words we all thought she might: regret, mistakes, lessons learned. But around her, the camera picked up the tremor in her hands. She looked small, so very human and so very exposed. Once, she had turned exposure into power. Now it betrayed her. The hostile takeover was not an explosion. It was arithmetic. Votes shifted. A coalition, composed of the people she had pushed away and the rivals she'd provoked, banded together, bought enough shares quietly over weeks, and opened a coup disguised as corporate governance. I had a seat at some of the meetings under the guise of a consultant, but mostly I watched from the sidelines, letting others deliver the blows I'd recommended. They executed it on a dreary Thursday. The board voted to remove her from her executive role, appoint an interim CEO, and launch a criminal referral. The building felt colder that day. The company's logo, once a beacon of her presence, looked like a brand name in danger. She tried to rally. She rounded the corner into the boardroom, shoulders squared, and spoke as if to the army she'd commanded for years. But the army had gone home or joined the enemy. The only hands she had left were fingers that had once trembled in loyalty. Her empire collapsed not all at once, but like an old painting with seams, color bled, edges flaked, the portrait became an inexplicable mess. Partners severed ties. Creditors called loans. The press went from skeptical to merciless. Lawyers circled like vultures. The company I had married into, so polished, so invincible, was reduced to memos and reorganization emails and the handover of executive cards. I remember walking past desks where people once clattered with energy and finding them empty. I remember the silence of an office tower that had never seemed mute before. There was an echo in every hallway that felt personal, like someone had taken her voice from the building and left the plumbing behind. And for all the legal and public theater, the most intimate kill was the way people looked at her now. Not with enemy hatred, necessarily, but with the cool distancing reserved for someone who'd been unmasked. There was pity. There was disgust. There was a simple refusal to be manipulated again. The final act came quietly. I had expected a showdown, some dramatic scene of accusations, doors slamming. Instead, it was anticlimactic. The interim board called for a closing session where contracts were renegotiated, severance terms discussed, and the logistics of her departure formalized. It was administrative, painfully so. It was final. I wandered the building that day with no real purpose, as if the marble floors could tell me where her shadow fell. Her office, once a throne room of glass and leather, was being emptied. Personal items were boxed. Photographs were being taken down. It felt like watching a funeral for a ghost who'd outlived her body. She surprised me by being there. I hadn't planned it. She sat at her desk in the dim light, sleeves rolled up, mascara smeared like the map of a life. The blinds were closed. Boxes lined the walls like small coffins. When she saw me, she didn't stand. She simply looked. The expression on her face was complicated: defiance, grief, calculation, collapse. I felt none of the triumph I'd imagined. There was only a cold clarity that I was finally where I needed to be. "Was this your revenge?" she asked, voice thin, incredulous. It was the same question she'd thrown at me months before in the boardroom, but now it had a worn edge, as if she'd been practicing it in the dark. I sat across from her on the visitor's chair, the chair she had once used to host men who sought favors. The room smelled faintly of expensive candles. The desk lamp threw a soft circle of light across our faces. "No," I said it plainly. My voice was even. "This was my divorce." She let out a sound, part laugh, part sob. "So this was cleanup. This was paper. It was a consequence." I leaned forward, not out of bravado but because something that had been lodged in me had finally dislodged. "You took everything from me. You told a story about who I was, and you edited me out of my own life. I didn't want your revenge. I wanted my name back." She looked at me like she was studying a relic. "And you got it by burning me. You burned what you built with other people's hands," I said. "That's different." She flinched, not from the truth but from the simplicity of it. The room suddenly felt very small. She reached for me then, not in anger but as if for an anchor. "Please. Say you don't feel," her voice failed. She couldn't find the words for regret that came without self-sabotage. I thought of Lily's laugh. I thought of the night classes, the diner booths, Malik's steady eyes. I thought of the man whose handwriting had signed declarations of love and wonder and how that man had been both real and a casualty. I'd rebuilt a life on steadier ground. I'd engineered a collapse not out of spite but out of refusal to be erased again. "What I feel is finality," I said. "I feel the end of something that should have ended long ago." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the clamoring resolution in them was gone. She was, in that moment, simply human, raw and empty. I felt pity, immediate and useless. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It sounded genuine in the way that small confessions often are when stripped of performance. "I know." I rose to leave. The boxes rustled as I passed. Her office door shut behind me, not with the polite click of closure but with the soft, reluctant thud of a chapter someone hastily ends. Outside, the city carried on. The paparazzi snapped photos. Lawyers made calls. The company's future was being rewritten by people with less charisma and more caution. I walked away without ceremony. Not triumphant. Not triumphant at all. Just lighter, as if the mansion's marble had been an extra skin I no longer needed. Weeks later, the legal dust settled into new contracts, settlements, and a restructured company. Clara's name would be associated with scandal for years, and she would rebuild in smaller ways, somewhere the world would not notice as much. She would survive, because she is hardy in the ways that ruthless people are, but she would not regain what she'd lost here. I took a small apartment with crooked floors and thin curtains. I read my old essays out loud in a park to people who applauded for the writing and not for the drama around the author. I taught more classes. People who had been citizens in my erased life returned slowly, some with guarded congratulations, others with new boundaries. Lily sent a message once, short, careful, and that was enough. The divorce was final on a rainy Tuesday. It was a stack of papers signed between lawyers, stamped, and folded. There was no private victory. There was only legal finality, and a feeling of quiet, an odd, muffled relief that life would proceed without the weight of her shadow. Clara called me after the paperwork was filed. Her voice was smaller through the line. "Do you hate me?" she asked. "No," I replied honestly. "I pity what you became." There was silence. Then, softly, "I'm sorry I ruined us. For what it's worth," I said, "you can rebuild. But not here. Not with what you used." She breathed. Then she said, "Goodbye." I hung up and walked across the room to open the window. Rain washed the streets. The city smelled of wet asphalt and possibility. I didn't cheer. I didn't savor the ruin. I folded the papers of the divorce into a drawer, practical and final. I made coffee and sat on the small couch and let the quiet settle. There was work to be done, mending the parts of me that had been made small, rebuilding a life on honestly earned ground. People ask, sometimes, if I regret what I did. I don't. I regret the years I lost before the crash, the nights I let her reshape me into someone willing to beg. I regret that she was someone I loved who turned into something else. But I do not regret reclaiming my life. Reclaiming it cost another life's ruin, and that fact sits in me like a bruise. It will fade, maybe, into something scarred and honest. At night, when the apartment is quiet, I still think about her in the rain, Clara laughing and wet, for a moment uncorseted. I sometimes think about how close I came to forgiving her in small ways. I sometimes think about how easily we can mistake ambition for love. But the final image that steadies me is small, her in that empty office, mascara smudged, asking if this was revenge. I am grateful the answer was simple. "No," I said in her dim room, months ago. This was my divorce. The ink dried. The papers were filed. My name was free of hers, and hers was stained with what she had built. I thought there would be a celebration, some burst of joy, a fist raised to the sky. But there wasn't. There was only quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise, because it carries the weight of years that can never be returned. I walked through the city that night, the rain soft and silver, washing the neon into rivers across the pavement. Each step felt lighter than the last. No chauffeur, no marble staircase, no weight of cold hands pretending to be love. Just me, breathing air that finally felt like mine. Behind me, in some high office stripped of power, Clara remained. A queen without a crown. A woman who had once commanded boardrooms now reduced to shadows and whispers. A wife in name only, abandoned even by the empire she sacrificed me for. And I realized then the cruelest truth of all, she had buried us long before the crash. She had buried me beneath ambition, beneath her cruelty, beneath the hunger that nothing could satisfy. But all she buried, was herself. I didn't look back. I walked into the night. Free. At last.